for joining today. We appreciate your support of our events and your participation. My name is Paul Sherman. I am the Director of Programs for SID Washington. So I helped to put all these programs together. But first and foremost, I want to thank our speakers today and our moderator for joining us and helping us speak to the community, sticking with this event, because I know we had this originally scheduled for March before some events happened. So we appreciate all of you sticking around with us and keep on keeping on with this. I think it's going to be a really great event. I also obviously want to thank our wonderful workgroup co-chairs for helping us put all of our events for the Food Security and Agriculture Workgroup. So that's Mark Castellino and Sabrina Ambergi. So thanks to both of you, as always, for helping us out. Before I leave it up to the co-chairs to kick us off today, just want to plug SID. It's the things we're doing coming up. I'm sure most of you are aware of who we are as an organization, as a neutral convener in the international development space to provide opportunities for networking and information sharing. So this is our bread and butter. This is actually our final event. We do have one more event tomorrow for our institutional members, but these are our last two events of 2020, which is really weird to say. But we do have a few events already scheduled for 2021. So check out our website. That's where you'll find all of our updated information. We have 3 events already. We'll have many, many more. Probably the first 5 months of next year will be very busy for us. So just check that out. Also plug 2, we should be announcing it fairly soon, but our career fair is on track to be about when it should normally be. This time it'll be probably in early February. So just stay tuned. We'll be announcing that fairly soon on our website. And with that, I will stop talking and hand it off to our co-chairs to kick us off today.
Great. Thank you, Paul. Good morning, everyone. I'm Sabrina Ambergi. As mentioned, one of the co-chairs along with Mark. If you haven't already, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. On behalf of the work group, thank you all for joining us this morning for what I think will be a really interesting session on innovation in the agriculture sector. We'll start with a couple of presentations and a panel discussion, and then we've also left about half an hour towards the end for Q&A. So please type your questions as we go along into the chat for that. We will be looking at some of the structural constraints to innovation and how those can be overcome. We'll take a close look at the success of Israel and how that success might be replicated, as well as some examples from Africa and Latin America. These cases highlight the different roles that both public policy and investment, as well as the private sector, play in making agricultural innovation happen. I'm thrilled that we have Lori Groves-Rowley moderating for us today. Lori is the Director of Global Food Security and Aid Effectiveness at the Lugar Center. She has nearly 20 years of senior leadership and committee experience on Capitol Hill. Most recently, she served as the Senior Professional Staff Member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, responsible for U.S. foreign assistance policy, including global food security and climate change. She served as Chief of Staff and Assistant to the Chairman during Representative Ralph Regula's tenure as chairman of 2 House Appropriations subcommittees, and she also brings experience in the private sector, representing an integrated natural gas company before federal agencies and Congress, with a focus on barriers to and technology research for new market development. So very relevant for our topic this morning. So Lori, thank you so much for joining us today, and I will hand it over to you to introduce the rest of our speakers.
Thank you very much, Sabrina. It's really a true pleasure for me to be able to join you as the moderator on this panel this morning. As a coincidence, we at the Lugar Center just finished a document talking about the importance of the public sector in agriculture R&D here in the United States. And so for me, it was just a really exciting opportunity to join all of you and to learn about the Israel example. And I had the opportunity to actually read the entire study before our program this morning. And I'm just really excited to hear from the co-authors, Danielle Abraham and Jonathan SID, as well as Thierry and Gogo. We'll hear from them one right after the other, and then turn to Elisa Burrows, who is overseeing a Feed the Future program on innovation. And it'll be interesting to hear how some of the things the United States has been doing in the global food security space compared to the kinds of leadership and opportunities that the government of Israel, together with the private sector and obviously the farmer, him or herself in Israel, and how these lessons learned can be applied to other countries across the continent in Africa. So I think it's going to be a great conversation. I'm glad you all are here bright and early here, at least on the East Coast, to join us. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to turn the program over to Danielle, and look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Lauren. It's great to be here with everybody. Good morning to everyone on the East Coast, very early morning to everyone on the West Coast, and good afternoon to everyone in Tel Aviv. So I'd like to jump straight in with a simple statement, especially for those of you who have not been to Israel or perhaps don't know much about Israel, which is, despite what you may have heard, Israel is not a natural nor sensible place to do agriculture. In fact, it's a little bit bonkers that it's even worked here at all. The reasons being are that Israel is a very, very small country. It's approximately just over 2/3 desert. There's great water scarcity generally. You can imagine with the desert, there's a lack of fertile soil, quite saline soil, and situated in a rather difficult neighborhood here in the Middle East. Our export markets have traditionally been just that further afield, which has presented huge post-harvest challenges. Yet despite what these seemingly insurmountable obstacles, Israel has not only managed in its very short history to create this agricultural transformation in and of itself, but really emerged as a global leader in agriculture and water management. And if we just skip to the next slide, we can see some examples of what we mean by that. Here are some of the production highlights from Israel, which showcase some of its achievements, both in citrus and in tomato yields. Israel is actually a leader in minimizing post-harvest loss with a fantastic number of less than 0.5% of grain losses, where the worldwide average is 20%. And I think if you look at certain developing nations, it's really much higher. But everyone in Israel is very proud of the Israeli milk cow being the most productive in the world. And also, if we skip to the next slide, you can see some of the achievements Israel has managed in actually making the desert bloom. This is in creating flourishing an agricultural sector in the desert. So the most obvious question to ask, and if we skip to the next slide, it's stated there, and which is asked by so many delegations that come to visit, is, well, how on earth did Israel succeed? It doesn't really make sense. So this was a fantastic question. I don't think until recently we had a serious answer to that question. And so I turned to good friends and colleagues now, Jonathan and Thierry, both at TBI and Agra, and I said, this is something very exciting, let's look into it. And they agreed. So what we did is I brought them to Israel, and with our fourth colleague, Meirav, we worked for a week. I created an incredibly tough schedule, and we schlepped them around the country, interviewing the who's who of Israeli agriculture, really from the past, from the oldest people that were still alive today that remember those days, right until the present. And we did all the hard work so you don't have to. So what we'd like to do today, or what I would like specifically, is to take you on a whiz-stop tour of the key findings. And if we go to the next slide, this is a summary of the key findings and what we found through all of our interviews. Israel, like any country, is unique. And that lends itself to having what we term underlying elements. We believe there were 3 key underlying elements which existed in Israel, which enabled Israel to create this mentality, almost as it were, there's no choice but success. And arguably, these 3 underlying elements cannot necessarily or easily be replicated elsewhere. However, there were also 5 enabling elements we've identified, which through this mentality of no choice but success were consciously created and therefore in a sense could arguably replicated elsewhere today. So what we're going to do is just going to take you on a whiz-stop tour of each element in turn, and hopefully that give you a sense of how Israel, this small desert country, really managed to create this agricultural transformation and what bits you might be able to pull out as lessons for elsewhere. So if we skip to the next slide, please, we'll start with the first. One of the first underlying elements is the ideology and this embrace of agriculture as a national mission. Now you might be thinking to yourselves, what on earth are we looking at here in the picture? And I'll try and give a short explanation because I think this is one of the key elements in understanding what was happening here. if we look back at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, especially as a neutral observer, something bizarre was happening. You had these Jewish youth from primarily wealthy middle-class backgrounds leaving their comfortable lifestyle and houses and trajectory to become a doctor or something in Europe and moving here to a swampy, malaria-infested land. And you think to yourself, well, what on earth is happening? Now, what was happening is that they'd actually been inspired and galvanized by this modern Zionist ideology. It said two things. The first was they wanted to establish the Jewish homeland, the state of Israel, but critically for us, it was driven by this new embrace of agriculture. It was influenced by communist themes, and they truly believed that there was no higher ideal than becoming a farmer and working the land. They wanted to see this barren, swampy, malaria-infested landscape turned into productive farmland. And it's quite hard to imagine today because the typical Jewish mother will say, you know, you can become a doctor or a lawyer and that's it. But here they are leaving their homes, their comfort. There was no FaceTime in those days to really call back home. And that is what you can see in the picture. These pioneers draining the swamps to create agriculture. And this is important because the standing of farming is quite low in places around the world. And that's one of the challenges. But here, it was perceived to be one of the highest ideals was to become a farmer. Now, the next slide shows the second underlying element. We believe these pioneers that moved here to do that created something we've called the pioneer mindset, which was they'd given up so much and they believed so much was at stake that there was no choice but success. They were not prepared to fail. And I think that mentality actually carries across in Israeli society. I don't know what you've heard about Israelis, but we can be pretty stubborn. And that also applies to, you know, not giving up and not giving into failure. And we love this quote that's here on your screen. This was said by one of the directors of Israel's one of regional R&D centers for agriculture. And he said, we believe that nothing is impossible until we prove it's impossible. So it doesn't matter what challenge your farmer is facing, the market is presenting, everything is possible, and we start from that baseline. And the third element, which is the underlying one, if we skip to the next slide, which is also unique to Israel, was the historical inheritance. The state of Israel did not emerge really in a vacuum, and the British were here beforehand, like they were in other places around the world. And I think there were two key things they left behind for the agriculture. The first was fantastic infrastructure. There were railroads already in place to transport goods around the country. But the second were agricultural infrastructure. For example, the Citrus Marketing Board. I don't know if you've all heard of the Jaffa Orange, which was very famous. But this marketing board was not unique here to Israel. I mean, if you look at Ghana, for example, they've got the Cocoa Board, which was a similar institution. So these were the three key underlying elements which really laid the basis for this mindset that we have no choice but to succeed. And then if we skip ahead, we're going to take you on a whistle-stop tour through the 5 key drivers behind Israel's agricultural transformation that we believe were the enabling elements. And I think the first and probably the most important, and Jonathan will definitely say this is the most important, was the strong government commitment to agriculture and the strong leadership that was shown. Now, I want you to remember that in the very early days, most of the Israeli cabinet and the government were made up of these pioneers or farmers that had been inspired by this ideology. And therefore, there was a great consensus across the cabinet in the government that agriculture was not only important, but it had to be prioritized. And this obviously resulted in several key things. The first was fantastic and consistent policy planning. The second was consensus about the fact that everything had to be provided to ensure that the farmer received support. Now, we interviewed one of the former ministers of agriculture, Shalom Simchon, who I think was in office in the 80s, and it will make you laugh, but he told us, you know, that the government believed that the job of the farmer is to grow his chicken as good as he can. Zeo, this is his job. He doesn't have to worry about anything else, and nor should he. The government or other actors, it was their responsibility to provide everything else to ensure that the farmer could succeed, whether that was finances, input, connections to market, the aggregation. And I think the third thing here under the government commitment to agriculture was you can see in the strong leadership the bold decisions that were taken, and critically, that they were backed up by budget. And I've got a very short story I want to share with you, which demonstrates this fantastically. I don't know how much you know about Israeli history, but Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, had this fantastic vision about making the desert bloom. And just for the Israeli geography, the bottom two-thirds of Israel is desert, and the top has a little bit more water. And the main water source is the Sea of Galilee right in the top of Israel. So obviously this vision to make the desert bloom is also a bit bonkers. And what they needed to do was to build a way of bringing the water all the way from the north of Israel, all the way down to the desert to even have a chance. So the story goes that David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister, invited a group of engineers to his office, and he told them the vision and the plan. He said, "Now I need you to go away and make it happen. I want you to bring the water 250 kilometers down into the south of Israel and make the desert bloom." And apparently the engineers went away, and they actually came back to him and said, "Prime Minister, you must be out of your mind. It's not possible." And if you skip to the next slide, you'll see his alleged response, which was, "Well, bring me the engineers who will make it possible." That's the story. And if you skip to the next slide, you will see in 1964, that's exactly what they did. They took a bold decision in the government, backed it up with a huge budget. And this picture from 1964 actually shows Shimon Peres, our former president, showing David Ben-Gurion the big national water pipe, which was then laid 250 kilometers and was one of the first big water projects undertaken. Now, the second enabling element, which I think if we skip to the next slide, we'll see a little bit more of, was about innovation and the approach to problem solving. I think critically in Israel, the government and leadership recognized very, very early on the great importance of investing in an agriculture innovation ecosystem and really investing in R&D, to the extent that Israel's National Agricultural R&D Center, the Volcani Center, was established in 1921, so actually before the State of Israel. And more than that, when they established and started to build this innovation ecosystem, the only focus was the farmer. The whole system was built around two key objectives. The first was to solve challenges facing the Israeli farmer, and the second was to bring new market opportunities to the Israeli farmer. And I think the last point, which is critical to understand about the role that Israel's innovation ecosystem played, is actually around its structure. So if we skip to the next slide, we should see a very basic diagram. It's just a triangle. We call it here in Israel the golden triangle. And we believe that this is actually part of the secret of Israel's innovation success. What you can see here is on the top point of the triangle is the Volcani Center that I mentioned. This is Israel's National Ag R&D Center. On the bottom left, you've got these 8 regional R&D centers, which are scattered across a very small country, and their role is to play an adaptation purpose between the innovations coming out and working hand in hand with the farmers. And the third on this bottom right corner is the Extension Service, which was traditionally very, very well funded and played an essential role, as many of you probably know, working hand in hand with the farmer. Now, there's 2 extra things that are important here. The first is that the farmer is in the middle, in red. And something you can't see here, even though it is 2-dimensional, is that this whole ecosystem is underlined by a flat hierarchy. Now, this is a quirk of Israeli society. I don't know if it came from the kibbutz and the communist nature, but there's no real hierarchy here in Israel, which meant in this innovation ecosystem, the average farmer would have absolutely no qualms about picking up the phone to the top scientist sitting in the National Institute in Volcani. And what this enables is a completely open flow of information, knowledge, innovation across the whole system. And I think that's critically important and incredibly hard to replicate, as we've seen elsewhere. Now, if we skip to the next slide, this is our third enabling element, which was a market-led approach. I think it's incredible to note today that when you look back at Israel's history, when it gained independence, it had not yet secured its own domestic food security. Yet, despite that, Israel always pursued this dual market approach. It was always going for food security and following the market. And the market really served as this northern star, both for the farmers, the innovation ecosystem, and all the other players. And I think this can be seen first and foremost in the shift in crops that Israel grew. It started with cotton, quickly moved to flowers, and then moved to fruit tree crops. And this was enabled by the innovation ecosystem. But also in the government approach, the government took a great responsibility to enable this market-led approach and actually had a government entity called Agrexco, which was responsible for the export market. And if we skip the next slide, I think there's something about the market-led approach. Oh, nope, there's something about farmer organization, that's fine. So the fourth element here is farmer organization. Now, I don't know if you've heard of the Israeli kibbutz. It was really like a socialist / communist venture of communal living. And it's quite famous. Many people came to volunteer on the kibbutz in the 70s. And many people will tell you, oh, we succeeded in agriculture because of the kibbutz. And that was kind of like a given until we started to dig into what was really happening. And what we found was that no matter what the setup was, Israeli farmers were organized from the get-go. So if you skip to the next slide, I think there should be a diagram of this exactly. Yesterday, we did a webinar with our partners in Rwanda. And one of the questions was, well, how did Israel deal with the smallholder farmers? And I had to explain that smallholder farmers never existed in Israel in the same way because they were always organized into larger groups. And this was critical. This enabled the farmers to come together for aggregation purposes, and it enabled them to gain purchasing power and bargaining power and to compete in the value chain. They weren't smallholder farmers, they were always part of a larger collective. Now the kibbutz was a very socialist model. The moshavim here was a more privatized version of the kibbutz, and then you had private farms. But the point was that no matter the model, there was great farmer organization. And now if we skip to the last and final slide for our final point, it was about international support. I don't know if any of you would recognize this box. This box was the of the Jewish National Fund. We, in my house, used to call it the blue box. And it was an international NGO really. And it was collecting donations from the diaspora to bring into Israel. Now, many countries today have fantastic diaspora and international support, whether it's from the diaspora or aid agencies. But I think what set Israel apart in realizing its agricultural transformation was the fact that all of these funds were channeled through the government and the government's priorities. They had a very clear set of priorities about what they wanted to achieve, and everything was aligned behind that plan, and that really enabled it to work. And with that, I think I can hand over to Jonathan, if he's there, to sum up for you all of the key learning lessons and pull them out from that story. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Danielle, for that. I just want to talk through 2 slides for you, which are basically sort of the lessons for other governments, for other low-income and lower middle-income countries that we can extract from this. So one is lessons for governments, and then secondly, lessons for development partners. And I'd just like to talk this through a little bit. And I think the key thing really is, for me, as Danielle mentioned, these various factors, the key enablers, the 5 that Danielle mentioned around government commitment, around the market-led approach, around an innovation ecosystem, around the international support and farmer organization. And how do you sort of start to build these factors out in different contexts, in your own context, in your own country, which of course has very different underlying factors to a country like Israel, different geography, different history, different context, different political system, etc. But those key factors are quite key. And so I think the key elements for government is how do you really try to channel the local national vision into tangible action around agriculture, and see agriculture transformation as central, not as a central part and a core part of the national development vision, rather than just looking at it like as though it is sort of just a line ministry or a line sector amongst the 20 or 30 others. But really the key thing is where transformation has happened in the way we've seen in Israel and other countries. It has been core to the national vision. National vision has been born out of agriculture transformation, which means therefore that agriculture is not just about food security. As Daniel mentioned, it's also about revenue. It's about widening the tax base. It's about job creation. It's about the current account balance. It's about empowering local local SMEs and local businesses, and seeing it in that way and being bold around that and its contribution to these key metrics of development is really essential. The other thing is how do we ensure that it is driven by the president, by the head of the government, as was in Israel under Ben Gurion, and ensuring that he or she have the platform to drive the agenda and manage the difficult politics that is around it. And I think often this is a challenge that we have sort of failed to really address, I think, in a number of low-income countries, where it's sort of been driven by the Minister of Agriculture, but not by the president. And that's not necessarily because presidents do not value agriculture in low-income countries. Many of them do. But how do we give them the platform, the systems, the structures to put them in the driving seat in a way that works given their agenda? I think the key thing also for ministries of agriculture themselves is how to collaborate with other key ministries, especially trade, industry, and investment. We've seen a lot of them ending up in competition with each other, duplicating each other's efforts, or not really, trusting in the work that's happening in other ministries. But these need to work together because the enabling environment requires each of them to play a different role, and this was the case in Israel as well. There was very strong coordination between these ministries, and each recognized they had a role to play to unlock the most transformative ag value chains. The market-led approach, of course, is crucial, and I think we do need to push, particularly on the development side and within low-income country governments as well, how to think more about products rather than about crops. So think more about soya milk rather than about soya, or cornflakes rather than maize. This allows us really to be much more targeted to the markets we want to target, and therefore allows much better organization of the value chain to fix the bottlenecks holding them back. And this was a key message also from Israel, who wasn't thinking purely about crops, but they were really thinking about how am I going to get our citrus fruits to Covent Garden in London. And that was driven from the outset. So this leads to the next point around prioritizing export-oriented value addition value chains. This is crucial because this is what brings in the money. Many country local markets are small, even though there's lots of growth, particularly with urbanization and the cities. But ultimately, having that export orientation, which includes having a sort of a lens on I don't like to use the word import substitution, but the word import competition. It's about how you can actually compete with imports, but that requires that export mindset is really important. And if we can prioritize that from the outset, that can really help with also with import substitution where there is a business case for it. And this is what Israel did. The coordination and principles of delivery is really important. By principles of delivery there, we mean how do you prioritize, how do you focus on a few value chains or a few agricultural reforms at the level of government, rather than trying to do too many value chains or too many reforms. And then how do you make sure that those are performance managed and planned properly and coordinated well, in a sequenced way, apologies. And then lastly, employing passionate people within government and bringing key people in to drive the role of government to develop value chain and enable markets. I think that's also a key lesson we took from Israel. And so the next slide is more, if you can move to the next slide, thinking more about development partners. And I think we categorize these into two main areas. One is how do you, in terms of putting the government aside, how do you support key actors in the value chain? And this is really about empowerment of local actors, whether it's farmer organizations, and I think there's a long way to go, for example, from the work we do across the African continent in empowering cooperatives who kind of have a long history of trying to, but there's still a big gap in terms of how we work with them to strengthen their governance mechanisms, for example, to build trust within the farmer organization in the local context. I think there's a long way to go there. And then secondly, an area where there's been some progress in recent years, but again, a long way to go, is in supporting what we call catalytic and visionary local SMEs, and also agro-industry, including FDI, but it's also our domestic investment through management support, through governance support. I was just in Malawi recently, and the ecosystem around access to finance solutions is improving a lot. But what people are saying, people that are looking at due diligence of SMEs and agro-industry businesses, is that a number of them still require support on corporate governance and really being set up not to be run as just a family-owned business or just have a sort of a short-term profit-taking approach, but really be planning to become a large business or a medium business, and therefore be set up with the right functions within the business to do that. And that requires us as development partners working differently with SMEs in a way where we can have more long-term mentoring, more long-term support around strengthening of the management structures of businesses, whether they're whether they're individual farmers, whether they're farmer organizations, whether they're SMEs or larger businesses investing in ag and in key enabling sectors for agriculture. And then the second point is around governments. So how do we really support governments who ultimately have to be the key driver? This was clear from Israel. It was clear from many other countries, whether it's Brazil or Vietnam or Cambodia. The government being in the driving seat to drive that ag transformation agenda is crucial. So what can we do differently to support governments to come together, rather than maybe inadvertently pulling them apart because we're having a narrow focus on our own projects? And so the key thing is thinking about singular programming and using government as a singular programming unit for resource deployment. This was key in Israel, and as Danielle mentioned, with the blue box, that money there was channeled through government and empowered government to invest in the key areas it needed to invest in: the R&D, the extension, the value chains it wanted to prioritize over a 5-year period. That was crucial. And I think that's also where a key lesson for partners. Likewise, analyzing with government and not for government. We do make a lot of mistakes, I think, still, where we have consultants, do a value chain analysis for USAID or so on, and then that sits with USAID mission, but it's not really owned by the government, or by local think tanks, and local think tanks and local research organizations are crucial here. So how do we do the analysis with government and with local think tanks rather than for them or for us, and then we just share the report to really help them with that prioritization exercise on value chains and on cross-cutting issues. The other thing is then around exploring new approaches for planning, prioritization, and coordination. We really need to think about how do we empower governments to coordinate with each other, with different ministries, so they can set the enabling environment for the value chains that are most transformative, for the products like the soya milk, where there may be a big market potential for the country to exploit, rather than inadvertently, working in our own silos and inadvertently maybe pulling different parts of government in different directions because, one ministry's report is effectively getting its money from Geneva, another one from Rome, another one from Washington, another one from London, and it doesn't quite come together. And that's a real issue in low-income countries. And the last point I'll mention is around balancing what we call technical with political here, which is not just looking at, this is of course a political economy point, but not just looking into what is, what makes most sense from an economics or a business or a farmer empowerment perspective and what we think governments should do, but really factoring in the fact, taking stock of the fact that governments have to be political, and you may need to go with the second best option or the third best or even the fourth best option, but that's better than they're not making progress. And so I think deferring and and treating governments also with that agency, I think is really important, because that's what allows for this empowerment of governments to play their role in enabling market-led, private sector-led value chains to develop is really crucial. I think I will stop there. So thanks for your attention. I think I'll just hand over now to our colleague from Agra, Thierry, who will look at the perspective of what it means from an African perspective, as with Agra, who works on agriculture development across the continent. Thierry?
Thanks, Jonathan. As always, it's very difficult to know what to say after you and Danielle, because you've had a very comprehensive presentation. Amazing. I'll be very brief and focus on what Agra does. This paper really speaks to Agra's raison d'etre. Agra works across different countries, 14 countries on the continent. As you heard from Danielle, many countries from Africa have traveled to Israel, delegates from African countries. They want to see the magic, how Israel did it. And if you look at the introduction Danielle made, it's totally the opposite of what we see on the continent. Israel has no water. Africa has more than enough. But why are things not really working the way they should be working? So under the policy and state capability work stream that Agra has been working on across all these countries, we really do find Israel example very relevant. I'll focus on 5 key areas which AGRA focuses on under that particular area of work. One is exactly the same thing Jonathan was talking about, high-level political leadership and commitment. This is extremely important. Across Africa, each country has a vision where they want to take their agriculture sector. It's very specific. It's very clear where they want to go. But when you break down that vision, the reality of having that vision fully implemented as such is not there. But part of what AGRA does is actually working with those governments to make sure that that vision can be realistic and pack that vision into specific priority investment areas. So one of the key areas is actually making sure that the investment countries are making are being made in the priority areas compared to each country comparative advantage. What works in Togo doesn't work in Ghana. So Ghana doesn't necessarily have to do the same as Togo. So AGRA's work is actually to sit with government to co-create solutions that work for them. And what we are starting to see now, what is starting to emerge, as really Daniel rightly said, agriculture in Israel was a national priority. What we would love to see as AGRA, and I'm sure that's what many African leaders would like to see, is actually now having agriculture considered as a national priority. You are not only talking about agriculture sector, you can't talk about agriculture sector and leave out industry, commerce. So can we really have that common vision of how agriculture sector is perceived? So again, part of the work we've been doing with the TBI Institute is actually how do we support countries promote their own investment opportunities. We've been doing this through the AGRF forum every year in September. We had a number of government delegates actually coming to pitch their investment opportunities. This is what we want to see happening on the continent, and we want that to come as a national priority investment programs, not as agriculture sector investment program, because that integration has actually to be seen from the onset. Area number 2 is around actually supporting countries coordinate better. There are a number of actors, good lessons Jonathan spoke about. In a number of countries, you have different actors operating from different angles, probably with different interests, but working within the same sector, and who are really poorly coordinated. Can we really coordinate better? So one of the key areas, again, AGRA has been really very intentional on is how do you help countries set up functional coordination mechanism where you bring all these actors together, make sure that their investment in the sector are aligned. So alignment is extremely important. You don't need really to have 20 projects working remotely on different things, yet you could have 1 or 2 projects and actually combine and join efforts together. So this is an area that AGRA has been really supporting. Area number 3 is around implementation capacity. Obviously, this requires some level of capacity, especially from a public sector perspective. You have a very thriving private sector who are able actually to bring in whatever skills and knowledge and expertise they need because they can afford to do that. And you have probably a very poorly resourced civil service. That's where most of the ag sector from government perspective sit. But how do you ensure that you really equip, you set up institutional mechanism that can help countries deliver on their own agriculture vision? It's a very important aspect. The critical issue is not necessarily lack of resources, because in some countries they have money, but they don't even have the absorption capacity. You know, how do you ensure that you support countries to set up mechanisms and frameworks that help them deliver in a most efficient manner? Third is obviously around now mutual accountability. All these key partners you see in the landscape have to be held accountable. You know, you sign up to specific mandate, you need to be held accountable. If governments are receiving grants or loans, it's important actually that those who are giving money, those who are giving loans, understand how governments are using those resources. Equally, if you're a donor community investing in the ag specs, you need also to be held accountable on the investment you're making. So this is a very, again, important critical area that AGRA has been supporting the government in. And lastly is around enabling environment. Some of these priority investment requires very conducive or rather adaptive policy making processes. If you are really attracting private sector in the agriculture sector, and there are very critical impediments that are related to policy or regulatory framework, how do you make sure that you can actually support the government address those bottlenecks in the most fashionable manner? The policy making process, especially in low-income countries, is known to take very, very long. You know, policy can take up to 5-10 years. How can you make that really quick? How can you address those policy bottlenecks in a timely fashion to make sure that the private investment can really flow in and quickly and support government efforts? I think I will just stop here for now because a lot had been really shared by both Jonathan and Danielle. But most importantly, AGRA doesn't work alone. So AGRA looks at partnering with those other being resource partners or knowledge partners. That's how we are together with TBI, with Volcani Institute, actually to look at how can we join hands to work with government, not for government, but work with them to make sure that we support them actually achieve the agriculture transformation journey. Thank you.
Thanks so much to all three of you for that dynamic presentation, and it's just a really informative piece. Before I turn to Elisa, I noted that I was a bit remiss. Many of you who signed on through the SID website, you saw the titles of our speakers, but all three of the authors we just heard from actually have all day jobs as well. So I wanted to highlight that Danielle is the Executive Director of the Volcani International Partnerships, and that Jonathan is the Senior Manager of Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. And finally, Thierry is the Head of State Capability with the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, or AGRA. So thank you all for taking some time out of what you do every day for putting this report together. It's been really informative, and I look forward to our conversation during the period after. One last piece about that, if you do have questions along the way, please go ahead and start to put them in the chat box, and we'll get to you following Elisa's presentation. And if there's something that someone can respond to quickly, they can even respond in the chat box, our presenters. So without further ado, I'd like to turn now to Elisa Burrows. I mentioned that she's working on a Feed the Future project called Feed the Future Partnering for Innovation. She's the Deputy Program Director for that with FinTrack. So welcome, Elisa, and it'll be interesting to hear from another perspective here about the U.S. Side of this innovation question. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Lori. Well, we've heard a lot today from Danielle and Jonathan and Thierry about overall what it takes to be successful in agricultural development. And I'm going to focus on one very specific aspect of that Partnering for Innovation focuses on, and that is how do you get new agricultural technologies into the hands of farmers so that they can improve production and quality. So if we can go to the first slide, I first want to start by briefly giving an overview of Partnering for Innovation for people who may be unfamiliar with it. So Feed the Future Partnering for Innovation is a USAID funded activity that works to build partnerships with the private sector to help them scale new products and services to smallholder farmers. We work in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and we provide partner agribusinesses with investment assistance, expert guidance, and the technical support they need to expand in emerging markets and create a growing customer base for their agricultural innovations. So our goal is to leverage and engage the private sector to help achieve development gains. And Partnering for Innovation started in 2012. And in the last 8 years, we've worked with 75 agribusinesses in 24 countries that have introduced 133 new agricultural technologies and services to more than 1.7 million smallholder farmers. We've leveraged more than $104 million worth of investment from the private sector as well. Next slide. So we think of agricultural innovation as a system, and at one end you have institutions researching and developing new and innovative technologies to solve common problems and increase efficiency in agriculture. And at the other end, you have companies that are selling products and services to farmers. So part of our role at Partnering for Innovation is to bridge these two ends so that research institutions can work directly with companies to make sure their technologies are getting into the hands of farmers. And in developing agricultural systems like we see in many places in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, this can be a really crucial step. And very often the private sector is overlooked as a tool for development gains, but they play a really important role in helping farmers access new technologies and services and in developing more robust market systems. And when bringing a product to market, the private sector will often already have existing distribution channels, established partnerships with other stakeholders like retailers or farmer organizations, and a robust knowledge of the target market. So working with the private sector can often be the quickest way to get new technologies to farmers. So throughout the rest of this presentation, you'll hear me use the word commercialization a lot. So I just want to quickly go over how we as a program define that. And commercialization is this process of the private sector taking a new technology or service and introducing it to a target market. So it starts at the point that the technology leaves the research and development stage and continues through production, market introduction, and scaling the volume of sales. So that includes everything from marketing to distribution logistics to customer service and after sales support. So let's go to the next slide. And over the years, we've worked with many companies and research institutions as they take technology from research and development to commercialization. Today, I want to share what we as a program have learned over the years about the successes and pitfalls of this process. I'll start here by sharing some key lessons, and then I'll give a couple of good examples we have from our portfolio of partnerships and talk about some of the lessons and success factors as they played out in reality. So first, there are some key lessons that I've grouped here into 3 big categories. The first is engaging the private sector early and allowing them to take the lead. So as you can probably guess, there is not one size fits all approach to commercialization. Each technology requires a tailored expertise and guidance for the intended market. And often the private sector is in the best position to provide this expertise based on experience introducing other products to markets. So it's important for research and development teams to engage the private sector early in the commercialization process. Even as early as the development phase can be really beneficial. The private sector brings a lot of field-based experience and can provide really helpful insight about how an intended customer may perceive or interact with a new technology. This can be really helpful in making slight modifications during the development process to ensure that farmers are getting the most out of their product. And the importance of the private sector in this process is something that I think research institutions and donor communities have started to embrace over time, and we've seen this change even within our program's lifetime. The second key lesson is stakeholder management is crucial. So we've also learned that the commercialization process is a very resource-intensive process, and it often takes a wide network of stakeholders to be successful. Networks can expand distribution reach, provide direct access to target customers, and provide much needed financing to enter new markets and scale. The donor community can play a really important role here, not only with financing, but with connecting researchers and private companies to networks of NGOs, farmer organizations, and government agencies. Relationship management can also include any capacity building that may be needed for a customer to successfully use a product. If it's a brand new technology and farmers don't know maybe how to use it. And it also includes any other stakeholder sensitization that may need to take place for a new product to be successful in the market. And then finally, commercialization is an ongoing process that requires a long-term view. So one of the biggest pitfalls we see is the assumption that because a technology is expected to be a big game changer, that it will immediately take off and be wildly successful on its own. Commercialization is an ongoing process. It requires constant evaluation and flexibility, and developing strong partnerships between research institutions and committed private sector companies, and a robust network of stakeholders is really key to successfully navigating this long-term process. So on the next slide, I want to look at a couple of examples of successful commercialization partnerships that we've seen. The first one I want to talk about is this partnership we had with Purdue University and Bell Industries in Kenya. So Purdue had developed the Purdue Improved Crop Storage Bags, or PICS bags. And these are a triple-line plastic bag that is a small-scale hermetic grain solution for smallholder farmers. So the bags provide farmers with an affordable and reliable way to store grain on their farms for multiple seasons without the need for pesticide. And Purdue had seen some success with commercialization of the bags in West Africa and wanted to expand into East Africa. So in order to do so, they partnered with Bell Industries, which is a Kenyan private company, and Bell then led the manufacturing, marketing, and local adoption of the technology over the long term. Partnering for Innovation provided financing in 2013, which allowed Purdue and Bell to increase access to and adoption of the PICS bags by smallholder grain producers across Kenya. And to date, Bell Industries has sold more than 1.2 million PICS bags, which have benefited more than 208,000 farmers. So on the next slide, we can look at the success factors of this partnership. In this case, Purdue identified its private sector partner actually during the partnership development phase with Partners for Innovation, so after they had already applied for funding from us. And that's a little later than we typically see, but it quickly became clear that Bell Industries had the capacity to successfully lead the commercialization efforts. Bell was already a well-known distributor of agricultural products in Kenya. The company already managed an existing network in the country and had the internal capacity in the form of people, processes, and technologies to lead the manufacturing efforts and to streamline the distribution. Bell also brought extensive market knowledge of the customer's willingness to pay and buying habits, which actually enabled them to quickly establish an accurate price point for the PICS bags. And this meant that the partners did not need to use valuable time testing, distribution, and marketing models to determine an appropriate price point, and they could therefore hit the ground running with targeted marketing efforts at the start of the commercialization process. Partnering for Innovation was actually able to leverage its extensive field presence in Kenya to expand the reach of the partnership, and we connected the PICS teams with the USA-funded Kenya Agricultural Value Chain Enterprise Project, or CAVES. And CAVES had already had a significant presence across Kenya's maize value chain. And it joined Bell Industries to test the use of PICS bags under various field conditions and directly with the farmers the project was already working with. So CAVE purchased bags from Bell, and they used them in demonstrations at events that were already planned in 22 counties across Kenya. And this dramatically expanded the marketing footprint for the bag. CAVES also organized PICS bags trials in collaboration with even more partners, other agribusinesses, the Ministry of Agriculture, farmers groups that they were working with, traders and buyers, and local NGOs. And this just really helped to get the PICS brands out there. The work with CAVES also allowed Bell a deeper understanding of how farmers were accessing PICS bags, which was actually primarily through private retailers and not through direct purchases from Bell Industries. And so the company was then able to make adjustments to its distribution model and focus more on those retailers. And this increased access to farmers, but it also made the logistics a lot more cost effective for Bell Industries. So after the success of the partnership with CAVES, Bell continued to find new ways to piggyback off of existing donor-funded programs and expand its marketing efforts that way. Purdue knew from the start that the success of their product was dependent on the private sector's ability to get the bags into the hands of smallholder farmers. And they fully licensed the production of PICS bags to Bell Industries. Under the company's lead, PICS really took off in Kenya. And as the sales grew, Bell continuously evaluated distribution strategies, marketing, and price point. The company continued to find new ways to reach customers and to engage its wide network of stakeholders. And even today, 7 years later, we're still in touch with Bell and still working with Bell Industries. And so we know that they're continuing to reevaluate distribution strategies, and especially in the face of COVID-19 and supply chain disruptions, this flexibility and continued evolution has really been key to Bell's success with PICS bags. So on the next slide, I want to give a second example, which is our work with Semilla Nueva in Guatemala. So Guatemala has the 6th highest level of chronic malnutrition in the world and the highest in Latin America. And maize is a primary staple around the country, but its low levels of key nutrients have left hundreds of millions malnourished. To address this, Semilla Nueva has commercialized maize seed that have been conventionally bred to have higher level of zinc, iron, and protein quality. And with support from Partnering for Innovation, Semilla Nueva is scaling sales of the seed in new and existing markets in Guatemala. In the last 2 years, Semilla Nueva has produced and sold more than 4,000 bags of seed, and these have bettered the nutrition of more than 100,000 consumers. On the next slide, we can look at the success factors of this commercialization. And Semilla Nueva is a great example of a private sector-led initiative. The company saw a need to address malnutrition in Guatemala, and they actually themselves went searching for solutions. And as a result, the company partnered with the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center, or CIMMYT, to introduce this biofortified maize seed. In addition to leading commercialization efforts, Semilla Nueva actually plays a really key role in continued research and development. The company manages 7 experimental farms throughout Guatemala where they grow new varieties of seed developed by CIMMYT in different climates and conditions. They evaluate pest and disease tolerance and drought resilience of these seeds, and then they share that data with CIMMYT. And CIMMYT then licensed Semilla Nueva, the most promising seed to produce and sell in Guatemala. And through this process, Semilla Nueva and CIMMYT plan to actually commercialize a variety of seed together. So the biofortified seed that Semilla Nueva currently has on the market actually performs better than many of its competitors. It's priced comparably and it tastes better by many accounts. And of course, it contains those key nutrients, but it does have one big flaw, and that is that the kernels look slightly different than traditional maize. They're a little smaller and a little off in color when you directly compare them to traditional varieties. And this is something that CIMMYT is continuing to work on in its research and development. But currently, it can be a problem when farmers are trying to sell their harvest. Because the kernels look a little different, buyers are inclined to offer a lower price. So in order to continue scaling the sale of the maize seed, farmers have to be able to sell their harvest, right, to buy more seed. Semilla Nueva has actually invested a lot of time and resources into sensitizing stakeholders, both the farmers and the end buyers, to show that the seed is arguably better than other varieties. Currently, Semilla Nueva is planning a massive communications campaign. We're working with them on this, and it's aimed at maize buyers and traders to educate them about the biofortified seed, and hopefully to stop this, the buyers from penalizing farmers with lower prices. Biofortification is not a new technology, but there are actually very few companies marketing biofortified seed in Guatemala. And Semilla Nueva feels this is because in the past, when companies have tried to promote biofortified seed, they expected farmers to pay more for the nutritional traits. And in turn, then those farmers expected markets and consumers to pay more for their harvest. But the reality is that neither farmers nor consumers are really willing to pay a premium for the higher nutritional content alone. So given this, Semilla Nueva understands that it has a very long road ahead of it, but it's really hoping that its model can prove the commercialization of biofortified seed can be successful, and eventually other companies will begin to sell competing seed. And we call this crowding in of the market, and it can actually be really helpful in creating more consumer confidence in a product and more consumer demand. And that can lead to greater market expansion for Semilla Nueva in the long term. So understanding this and outside of our partnership, SAMI and AWEBA is looking at how it can help shape policy in Guatemala to start to incentivize the sale of biofortified seed and hopefully spark that crowding in. So the next slide is the last slide. That's just a quick look at some of our work with technology commercialization. I've included Partnering for Innovation contact information here. If you want to learn more, we're always thrilled to share lessons from our work with the private sector. We also have a number of tools and resources available on our website, including a number of guides focused specifically on the research to commercialization process. And so I've included that link here as well.
Thanks very much, Elisa. Very interesting. And especially the case studies too really bring the partnership with the private sector to life and really help to illuminate both the opportunities and the challenges on the ground in some of these countries. Again, as a reminder, if you have a question, please feel free to post it in our chat box. And in the meantime, as you're putting that together, I thought I'd start off with a couple of questions for some of our panelists. And just a reminder, we have about 30 minutes, so I think we can have a really healthy and vibrant conversation. One of the things that struck me when I read the report was the issue of vision and leadership. And when Sabrina introduced me and read my bio, most people know me as someone who worked for Senator Lugar in the US Senate, but I did spend, as she noted, a long part of my career working for my hometown congressman from Ohio. And whether we were talking about policies in the natural resource area with our country's public lands or national parks, or whether we were talking about health research in the NIH or what was happening with health policy, he always used to use the words, Lori, it's about vision and leadership. And without those two, you cannot accomplish a goal. And your report on what Israel did in its history just really hits that point home so clearly. And I wonder, Danielle, if you could talk with us about your work with the agriculture transformation in Israel and its history, and how it might take these strengths, including the vision and leadership on behalf of the government and other partners, the research partners, et cetera, in Volcani, to push or share these ideas and these concepts and success stories with leaders in developing countries. I know that Theory talked a little bit about that with some of the countries in Africa, but also how might leaders in African countries or even other parts of the globe seek out some of the expertise and the experience you have in demonstrating that success.
Thank you, Laurie, and thank you so much, Alyssa, as well. It was a fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed it. It made me think, and I think it's underlined one of the things I'm about to say even more so. To be honest, I don't actually have a good answer. And I think that's part of the problem. I mean, consciously, not because I haven't thought about the question. I think there's a huge challenge here in successfully sharing knowledge, expertise, innovations. And I haven't found a model that has been done well enough to realize the vast potential. I think in Israel's case at the moment, what I would like to see more of and what we're working to achieve more of at Volcani International Partnerships can be broken down into 3 areas, I think. I think the first is in innovation. Israel has built this unbelievable innovation ecosystem with the R&D leadership of Volcani, with the local R&D centers, with the extension services. And yet until today, it's been almost primarily and exclusively focused on solving the challenge of the Israeli farmer. I would like to see how we could put that innovation ecosystem at the service of greater global agricultural challenges. I mean, if they could overcome challenges here in Israel, what would that look like? To really put that innovation capacity at the service of other challenges. I think there's a great deal more to do under that innovation category of commercialization. I have too many stories to share at the moment, anecdotal stories of innovations we found, sitting on the shelf that could be so impactful, but are still sitting there. And I think there's a great deal more that could be done in terms of collaborative research and innovation, partnerships between the Israeli scientists and scientists elsewhere. I think the second area, which we personally at VIP are really pushing, is putting the expertise up in front. Really, I think I've seen a lot of delegations from Africa, but really all over, coming to Israel on this almost technology shopping exercise. You know, they come with their virtual shopping basket and they're looking around and they're like, oh, this is really cool, and look at the drones and this, and they kind of want to put the technology in their basket and go back home and implement it. And we try to explain that that wasn't the approach that Israel took, and nor is it necessarily the best approach to take. And what Israel did fantastically was invest in the development of expertise, which really resides in two places, both the scientists and the agronomists, the extension workers. And we would like to see how we could put those experts more at the front of our collaborations too. And we're trying to do that with partners by building tailor-made teams with specific expertise. And I think the last thing, which is more about sharing the knowledge and the know-how, we're really struggling at the moment with this concept of centers of excellence. We're getting a lot of requests from governments and around the world, really, and partners. Could you come and establish a center of excellence, and through that share Israel's agricultural expertise? And our challenge back is, well, what do you mean by that, and how does it work? As we've said, I think everyone has said here, agricultural success is not just about the agriculture, it's really about so much more. And if you establish this training center that exists in isolation without the support mechanisms, the enabling elements such as access to finance for the farmers, you know, the aggregation, the connection to market, it almost fails. So we are trying to rethink at the moment this center of excellence model and see if that could be a better channel through which we can actually share Israel's agricultural experience and expertise. And if anyone's got any better ideas, we're always open to hearing them.
Great, thanks. That was very helpful. I know that we have a question from Jay Brannigan in the chat box, and I know, please identify yourself, but Jay doesn't have to. He's a colleague of mine at the Lugar Center. So I know Jay, and thanks for the question, Jay. If you can see it, Elisa, it's actually for you. And he is asking if there's any political pushback in Guatemala over the fact that Nuevo Semilla controls all the seeds, and the farmers have to buy the new seeds each year instead of being able to use their own surplus seeds for the next harvest.
We have not experienced any government pushback, no, but as a USAID program focused on the private sector, we tend to avoid the government. But Semilla Nueva hasn't really experienced any of that either. And actually, they have a pretty good relationship with the government in Guatemala. They're part of this new work to try to incentivize biofortification is happening with the government. But I think that there's not pushback because it is a really good seed, and it's not that Semilla Nueva is trying to have a monopoly on the seed. They actually want to see more people selling the seed. They actually want that competition, and so it's not that they're trying to hold that monopoly or prevent farmers from buying or using seed that might be better. They feel like they have a really good product that actually produces more than the traditional seed. I didn't get into this, but there are various price points of the seed on the market in Guatemala, and the tier that they're in, the most popular seed is a hybrid that I think is from like 1983 or something. It's a very old seed that hasn't been improved upon, and so Semilla Nueva feels that they're really bringing this a much needed product to the market, and I think a lot of people see that as well.
Very good. Thanks very much. I'm going to just go back and forth for a moment or two to pull out just a couple of other policy questions and then go back to the chat box. This one I'd like to call on Jonathan about. Jonathan, like AGRA, the Tony Blair Institute supports governments across Africa to attract private agriculture investment and spur innovation. And given the lessons for partners that you outlined in your slides, what are some of the practical ways that partners can support governments to better liaison with innovative partners, in the private sector, and to drive key reforms around innovation in the public sector? For example, around extension services, which was actually talked about a good bit in the report, and also African agriculture research centers.
Thanks for that, Laurie. And I think this comes back also to the question that you asked of Danielle as well around leadership and vision. I mean, we find that there are, we're working in Africa across 16 different countries, not in agriculture in all of them, but in most of them, in about 10 or 11 of them. And what we find is that just like you have leaders, you've got within government, you've got progressives, you've got visionaries, and you have people who are there also for the status quo, let's say, as well. And likewise, that is also true in the private sector. That is also true when it comes to farmer groups. That is also true when it comes to think tanks and local research centers and civil society. And I think the key thing really is about how to empower the leaders and the would-be leaders, in order, because they have their own vision for their own country, but often because of political challenges, because of just the nature of bureaucracy, because of the challenges of organization, of coordination, of not knowing which partners to reach out to for what, not knowing what's out there that could help them with problem solving, then they typically tend to struggle. I mean, on the government side, we know that if you're a minister or a president, you spend 90% of your time not on your agenda. You spend it on meetings, on traveling, on putting out fires here and there, and only, if you're lucky, 5 or 10% of your time on what's really, what your agenda is, what your development program is. And so I think the answer to that is really about, to answer to your question, is really about responsiveness, about trying to be, whether it's to governments, whether it's to research entities, whether it's to the private sector that's really investing in value addition, in problem solving, whether it's to the farmer organizations that are better run, that are visionary, that want to really improve outcomes for their membership. It's really about trying to be responsive to those leaders in those different parts of the ecosystem to help them drive forward their own agenda. And if we can do that, we can strengthen the innovation ecosystem, because ultimately what these people are doing is problem solving. And the flip word to innovation is problem solving within the local context, and being able to prioritize on fixing the most important problems. So if we can design programs which are responsive to local leaders, not just in government, but in government, yes, because the government is essential for fixing market failures and so on, but also in these other different groups I mentioned, then that can really help also plug in other partnerships and other connections, while empowering them to drive the local change that they want to see, given it's their own country. And I think we do need to be a bit more creative and a bit more forward-looking to design facilities that allow us to be responsive to the problems that need to be solved by local leadership. I think there are various ways to do that. I mean, programs that apply adaptive management or PDAA type approaches is one way. Long-term mentoring and business development support for local SMEs and local farmer organizations is another way, but going in a way where we're really very demand-led. That's another. And then also having facilities that can plug in certain skills that may be missing locally, like, for example, legal skills or negotiation skills with the private sector and so on. I think there's different mechanisms that could be addressed, but the underlying factor there is just responsiveness to local leaders, whether they're in government, private sector, farmer organizations, research institutions, because then they will find together, if we can do that, they will drive the strengthening of the ecosystem, basically, around innovation in the local context. That's basically what Israel did. It had a long time horizon to do that, and it had the sort of the singular programming, right? The funding and the international support to drive its own program into place. And I do think we need to try and think of those mechanisms that allow us to do that, but they can be designed if we're able to design them with those principles of responsiveness in mind, I think.
Very good. Thanks. That was really, really helpful. Thanks very much, Jonathan. I see we're getting another couple of questions in the chat box. Maybe we'll take the Congo one first, and maybe Danielle, you could even broaden it to apply to other countries across Africa and developing countries in general, about the best way to reach out. And Martin has asked this question. I'm not sure, Martin, if you're asking about directly with an outreach with the government to share the experience, or with private sector or farmers, or what. You might want to clarify that for us, but how best to connect with Israel, regardless of its the country or whoever.
Yeah, I'm talking more about private sector. Yeah.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah, I'm saying that I'm talking more about private sector.
Oh, private sector. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So maybe Danielle, could you take that about how private sector from other parts of developing countries could connect with Israel and its experience?
Yes, I mean, are we talking practically speaking, who should they reach out to? Or are we talking, different models for their engagement? I mean, I can speak to both very quickly, which might be the best.
That sounds great.
Just because I'm online anyway, I'd be very happy to share my email address. It's something that we do, trying to promote Israeli agricultural experience, expertise, innovation in the private sector here. So I'm very happy to facilitate anything I can in the interaction with Israel. I think in terms of the model engaging with Israel's agri-tech private sector, one of the key organizations that could be helpful here is actually an organization called Startup Nation Central. It's an NGO, and they've mapped out all of the agri-tech ecosystem. They actually have a database online where you can search for all the different companies that exist here in Israel today. What we commonly find is the challenge, which is why we as an NGO are approached, is because many of the actors trying to engage with different companies in Israel don't actually know or are in the position to distinguish between them. So if you're looking for a drip irrigation company or a drone company or whatever it may be, you might find 10 fantastic companies. Actually understanding which ones might suit the needs of the specific country really requires the expertise. And sometimes we are approached to provide the expertise and help guide, the choice or the identification of the right technology, whether it's from Israel or elsewhere. So I hope that answers your question. But if not, feel free to write to me privately. That's okay.
Thanks very much, Danielle. Before we turn to another question for Elisa, I wanted to quickly bring Thierry into the conversation. Thierry, when I was reading the report, there was one quote that really stood out to me, thinking about lessons learned with what Israel did to develop its agriculture sector. And that was the leadership of the value chain for farmers to support their success in the global marketplace. And Danielle even alluded to it in the presentation when she said, the focus was that the farmer was supposed to, grow the best chicken, and everything else was going to be someone else's job. And the quote was with regard to the citrus board. It said, smallholder farmers cannot go to Covent Garden to sell their produce. They need an organization on top of them. So when it comes to agriculture across the African continent, whenever any of us in the policy area discuss this, we always talk about the focus on the smallholder farmer. What is your sense of the development of such value chains for smallholder farmers in African countries? And I know not one size fits all, but maybe there's one country you could talk about where the value chain development has come along. One of the things I know that the Feed the Future program has really tried to focus on over these nearly 10 years that it's been working is to look at that value chain and help farmers get access sort of en masse together into even a regional market or a global market. Maybe if you could give us an example, I think that would be really exciting and positive feedback for us to hear about.
Yeah, thanks, Laurie. I think under the investment prioritization area of work that AGRA has been supporting countries in, priority value chain is actually one of the area we focus on. As you rightly said, countries have different priorities, and the environment is not necessarily conducive for all the value chain. A quick example, for example, in Burkina Faso, the government is putting priority on rice. One, because they really want to reduce the rice import bills, that's one, but also because the country actually provide that conducive environment for the rice value chain actually to flourish. So that's one area we've been really supporting Burkina Faso in. We've supported government to design what we call like rice flagship, which has now become a presidential flagship initiative, getting again into that leadership we've been talking about. So raising that profile from a ministry-led initiative to now becoming a presidential-led initiative, that really is going to be attracting the attention of everybody, being in the public sector as well as private sector. In Tanzania, we've been supporting value chain prioritization. We've partnered with our partners, BFAP in South Africa, looking at different value chains. And interestingly, they came up with this model which they applied to Tanzania, showcasing how, for example, sunflower oil is a priority value chain that the Tanzanian government and the private sector should actually support. But that requires really huge level of engagement. If Tanzania is prioritizing coffee and tea, for example, for export, and you come up with, sunflower oil, something probably they haven't really looked into, getting the government and partner attention, you need evidence, and you need that regular and consistent engagement, using obviously whatever evidence you might have to support that prioritization program. And I also think what is very important is actually sequencing. Even once you've identified the value chain priorities the country should focus on, sequencing is extremely important, because countries can't really embark on implementing any priority value chain they have. Sequencing is absolutely going to be critical, because you need to bring different partners on board. You need to mobilize resources. Government doesn't have money that is ready to invest. Partners have actually to believe, in the entire political system for them to feel comfortable to invest. So there is really a lot that needs to be done, even to make sure that those prioritized value chains can fully embark on the implementation and start showing results at country level.
Great, that's super helpful. Thank you so much, really interesting. I see we're already getting really short on time, so I'm going to take the last couple of questions in a group and just try to do a lightning round so that everyone who had a question can be heard. Elisa, I hope you had a chance while we've been hearing from Theory to see that sort of lengthy question about PICS in Malawi, and just talk about other opportunities for people to engage without direct kinds of funding, and just try to get this going. And Danielle, a great question to you about engaging youth, because your report did talk about youth, engaging Israel youth in the early days. And finally, the question that Mark has provided to us with regard to extension services. I think that's a really good one. And your report actually talked a lot about extension services and how important they are. So if we could just do a lightning round in the last 5 minutes or so here, that would be great. Who wants to start? Elisa?
I can start, yeah.
Okay,
so
thank you.
The question about Zambia is that PICS is in Zambia as well, and the distribution model there has maybe started to fall apart a little bit. They're not readily available. And so are there other recommendations for engaging? And I would say, I mean, the reason PICS was successful in Kenya was because Bell Industries was such a strong private sector partner, and they had the capacity to get the bags out into the market. So and they haven't continued. We worked with them 7 years ago for 1 year. That was our funding period. And they haven't continued to produce the bags because we've continued to give them money. They are doing it because they're making money off of it. And they think it's a really great product. So it sounds like maybe in Zambia, there's not that strong private sector partnership between Purdue and a local distributor. And so maybe Michelle, I don't know what your relationship with Purdue is, but maybe there's some leverage there where you can maybe help encourage them to look at licensing the PICS bags to a partner that does have a strong distribution network already. PICS is an interesting model because it has been really wildly successful in some places like Kenya, and it's really struggled in other places. And I think those partnerships are really key to whether or not the marketing of the bags is successful.
Great. And youth, Danielle, and then extension, everybody.
Okay, yes, fantastic question. I think there has been some effort for the youth activation outreach. I'm not sure it's been enough, and we're meant to launch some new programming this year with Malawi and Tanzania with the Tanzanian Agricultural Development Bank. I mean, we planned and COVID, or God laughed. And I'll just say 2 quick sentences on that. The example in Israel, there was a quasi-military agricultural unit called Nahal. And what they did, they really believed that inspired entrepreneurial leaders, if empowered, could really lead the change, a wider change. Identifying those kinds of people with a sparkle in their eye that you just know they're going to be successful no matter what field they go into. And that's exactly what Israel did in the early days. They took these youth leaders and they sent them out to the worst places in the country to do agriculture, such as near the Dead Sea. And they really provided them with all the support that they needed. And they were tasked with creating successful agricultural production units and then sharing their knowledge more widely. Perhaps this is what we sometimes call nowadays lead farmers, but it was really much more than that. It was a concerted effort. And I don't know if Jonathan, Thierry, remember we sat with one of Israel's fathers of the innovation ecosystem here, Yossi Vardi, who told us the way to succeed is to invest in your diamonds. He called them diamonds. He said, this is the way forward. Identify the diamonds, put all your efforts into them, and they will be your multipliers. So based on that example of what Israel did, we designed this program called the Israel Africa Pioneer Program, which was meant to launch in Malawi and Tanzania with the Agricultural Development Bank there this year. And the idea being that we would identify already successful agricultural entrepreneurs who would be provided with 2 to 3 years comprehensive holistic support from Israel, extension and everything that you could think of. And they would also have to commit to sharing their findings more widely. And maybe they would serve the aggregating function, things like that. So that's what we were looking at. And I just want to add one sentence on to the extension question that was asked about, does this create greater awareness and demand? I just want to share something from Israel. Often what happens, people come to us and say, well, how do you convince the Israeli farmers to adopt the new technology? And the answer is, especially from the innovators, well, actually, how can we convince them not to adopt it yet? Because it's not really ready. While the technology is in the pilot phase or it's just being tested, the farmers are already working so closely with the scientists. They see initially good results and they're already adopting it. And lots of things play into this, obviously the trust, the open communication, but also the fact that the Israeli farmers are very well educated as well. So that was just an interesting perspective from Israel.
Very good. Anybody else quickly on agriculture? And then I want to turn the program over to Mark for some closing remarks.
Just on the extension question briefly, I don't know about the answer to Mark's question around early adopters and encouraging peer learning, which I think is definitely important. But in the countries we work in, the key issue is really the fact that the extension service is fundamentally missing or very weak and hasn't been invested in an institutional way for many decades, I think since the 80s. This is sort of in an African context primarily. And I think that is something to recognize. There definitely is a question of, how do you resource it from a public perspective? And I think that there is a case because of the positive externalities for partners to engage more in supporting the government extension workers, because it remains critical. But at the same time, also the importance of partnering, obviously, with the private sector, right? And identifying private sector, whether it's through contract farming systems or whether it's through processors or who want to increase their supply, their input supply, partnering with them to slowly build up that footprint of extension. It's a huge job. It's very expensive. And there needs to be a sort of testing of different models of viability. But I think, again, this comes to Thierry's excellent point about sequencing. And so if we're able to help governments and countries focus on a few value chains and get those, put the enabling environment in place for those value chains that have the most transformative potential, not just in terms of crops, but also in terms of products, then this will help bring money into the system and strengthen that extension service in turn. And that extension service should be seen, I think, as part of that effort to develop those value chains, and then identifying what is the right mechanism to strengthen the extension services, whether it's on the public sector side or the private sector side, but ensuring those linkages between farmers and the market, which ultimately has been missing and has really led also to that sort of the drying out of resources for ag extension services in many African and low-income countries.
Very good. Thanks for that. Over to you, Mark, to close us out.
Thanks very much, Laurie, and thanks to all the panelists, Danielle, Jonathan, Thierry, and Elisa. What a great discussion on an important topic. My name is Mark Castellino, and I serve alongside Sabrina as co-chair of the Food Security and Agriculture Workgroup. This is our final workgroup event for the year, and despite all the challenges that we've had this year, it's been a really great series of events. We started out in January with an event on the elevation of resilience within USAID and the development agenda. And it was really timely because it came a few weeks before the official standing up of USAID's new Bureau for Resilience and Food Security. And we had a great panel from USAID, Mercy Corps, and from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Then in May, and as it so happened, that was our last in-person event. And then in May, we had an event that really kind of addressed the issues that we were seeing both here in the United States and overseas with the impact and food insecurity of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we heard from some groups working here in the DC area on food insecurity, as well as looking overseas at what was happening there. Then in October, we partnered with the Youth in Development Workgroup here at SID, and we had a fantastic event on young African women leaders in agriculture. And we really lent into the virtual nature of our events with the possibility of having young African women leaders speak themselves to this audience on how they have pioneered and created their careers in agriculture. And now we've rounded out the year with this fantastic event. Our next event will be a planning meeting, which we'll hold early next year. And you may not be aware, but all SID workgroup events are conceived, organized, and executed primarily by volunteers. And so we need your ideas about topics for our 2021 calendar. So that planning event will be a great opportunity for you to participate in mapping out our events for next year. So watch out for an announcement on the date of that meeting. And so all that's left for me is to thank you for joining us today, to encourage you to provide your feedback on the event feedback survey. The link is in the chat box, and you'll also receive an email with that survey link. And then lastly, to wish you a happy holiday season. See you in 2021.
Bye. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.